right, so tonight I wanted to talk to everybody about college athletes. College athletes are highly recognizable. You see them on TV, you see them in magazines, social media, you recognize them. It's easy. What isn't as recognizable though is the fact that universities are exploiting these student athletes. You see, student athletes promote the schools they play for. They bring in a huge amount of revenue, and yet they receive very little in return. I'm gonna point out how student athletes are living below the poverty line, how student athletes are not covered for the injuries during which they play, how student athletes are restricted from trying to create their own income, and lastly, how they're robbed of the higher education they're promised. So first, student athletes are living below the poverty line. This seems crazy, yet Daily Finance reported that many star athletes are living below the poverty line, and at the University of Florida, which had the highest combined football and basketball revenues, while its players' scholarships left them living $2,250 below the federal poverty line, and $3,190 at a scholarship shortfall. Next, I'd like to talk about how student athletes are left vulnerable from the injuries they sustain while playing. You see, you would suspect that, okay, they're playing in a university, these are huge schools, generate a lot of money, so they're covered. But that's not the case. The New York Times covered a player named Kent Waldrop. Kent Waldrop was a player at TCU, Texas Christian University. Well, during one of his games, he snapped his neck and was paralyzed from the neck down. Did Texas University pay for his medical bills? No. The only reason he had surgery performed was through donations. The university didn't even pay for his wheelchair. And not only that, but they canceled his scholarship since he could no longer perform. So now, one of the reasons they don't have proper health insurance is because they're not really working. So we're all students, most of us have jobs. You're probably thinking, well, they can work, I work. So that brings me to my next point. That the NCAA, which sets restrictions in place for all athletes and universities, this restricted athletes from earning money. They're only allowed to work a job that earns about $2,000 a year. And they're not allowed to promote their name or affiliation with any brand or corporation to create revenue. So go ahead and think about how long they've worked at their craft, how they finally get attention, how they might come from low-income families, and their names, merchandise is being sold to their likeness, and yet they're not able to gain any profit from that. Some athletes are left trying to sell the merchandise that they are given to play with. Oregon Live stated that Oregon basketball players Ben Carter and Dominic Artis were suspended for selling team-issued gear online. This isn't the only instance Oregon had. They also caught student athletes selling Jordans that were Oregon edition. But people were paying $5,000 for these shoes that these kids can't afford to really eat. They're only given so many meals in the cafeteria. Lastly, the only reason these athletes come to these schools is for an education. So you might be thinking, okay, well, they're not there to make money. They're there to get an education. They're at a Division I school. It's a nice university. Education is expensive. That's where they make. But see, that's not always the case. Since college athletes travel so often, train on the off season, practice throughout the week, and go on the road for games, they're left with a fraction of the education that we receive. Mary Willingham recently told CNN, Mary Willingham is a learning specialist for the University of North Carolina, that she had been forced to teach multiple athletes how to read. So this is clear that they're not gaining the education they're supposed to be. They asked her to teach them how to read so they could know what was being said about them in newspapers and magazines. So, as you can see, universities generate all this money because of the performance from these students. Yet the students don't really get much from their hard work. They're living below the poverty line. They're left to pay for their own injuries if they sustain them. They're restricted from trying to create any income on their own. And lastly, the contract that they signed with the promise that they would receive a higher education is also not given to them.
Thank you. All right, Adrian, several good things at the beginning of the speech. The propositions clearly identified. There's an excellent preview of the supporting structure. And I think that it's pretty obvious that there's controversy on the subject. It gets talked about on a pretty regular basis. And you've got a couple of examples that seem to suggest that there is something that is definitely wrong with this process. In the body of the speech, I think it's also well organized. You signpost those individual points as you get to each issue, so you're doing a good job there. The background, I think, needs to be a little bit more involved, because the idea about the amount of money that the schools are getting based on this, I think, is a bit problematic. You assert that, and there ought to be more proof on that. The example that you have of the injury, that's the one example that you have on that particular point, and I don't know that that is in fact the policy of every place else. I don't know what Texas Christian University's position on this is, so I don't have much context. But if you have reason to believe that other universities don't provide insurance for their student athletes, they don't give them any kind of coverage in case of injury, like you're talking about, that's a catastrophic injury. I think that needs something more definitive than just the single example, although it's a good example to kind of build your position, because it certainly seems to suggest that there's something illegitimate or unfair about what's going on. You make reference to NCAA restrictions, but you never cite those restrictions except in the most general way possible, so we want to have source citations for some of those points, and I think that was kind of a problem in several places. You had a couple of source citations early on that I thought were effective, but you were less consistent about that. You mentioned the kids living in poverty, and you've got the story of the guys selling their shoes online, and I'm going, well, if they're getting $5,000 for the shoe, I'm not exactly sure poverty is the thing that they're trying to solve here. That sounds to me like they're exploiting their situation rather than doing it out of necessity. It was not clear that they were poor students who couldn't eat, and therefore they needed to sell their shoes in order to be able to get, clothes or go to the movies or whatever the heck it is that they didn't have enough money to do. I think we need to know a little bit more about that particular case. If they get passed out a bunch of, was it Jordans? Yeah. Because they're at Oregon and Nike just gives away all that crap all the time to their school. That seems like they're exploiting the system instead of the system's exploiting them. So I think you need to make sure that the story on that is the way you have described it there. I thought your delivery was very calm and effective. I just think that your proof needs to be a little bit more efficient in order to make the argument, and you need to cite the information a lot more consistently. All right, thank you.